listener production.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Antoinette Lattouf. Earlier this year, AI-generated fake pornographic images of Taylor Swift were shared across the internet millions of times. But it's not a problem that's just affecting huge celebrities. Regular people, mostly women, have been targeted, and the federal government says it wants perpetrators behind bars.
This behaviour is unacceptable, and it's so unacceptable that we are going to criminalise it and provide serious penalties for it.
In the second half of this episode, Attorney General of Australia, Mark Dreyfus, joins us to explain the scale of this problem and how a new crackdown would actually work. But first, let's get to all of today's top headlines with Helen Smith. It's Wednesday, June 5th.
Morning, Antoinette. US President Joe Biden has said in an interview with Time magazine that, quote, "There is every reason for people to draw that conclusion," end quote, in response to a question about whether Benjamin Netanyahu is prolonging the war in Gaza for his own political self-preservation. Now, the interview with Time magazine was published overnight, our time, and covered a wide range of topics, including the current investigations by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, as to if Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza, with the US president saying that, quote, "The ICC is something that we don't recognise. But one thing is certain, the people in Gaza, the Palestinians, have suffered greatly for lack of food, water, medicine, etc. And a lot of innocent people have been killed," end quote.
Yeah, it's interesting that Biden talks about Palestinians suffering greatly, and I note a change in his language, and I think it should also be pointed out as potentially just political opportunism on the President of the United States' behalf, because the US has provided diplomatic and financial cover for these atrocities. And we can't forget that there is a US election in coming months. And since March, the majority in the US, all polls have shown, disapprove of Israeli action in Gaza. So it's interesting to listen to Biden talk about some politically strategic decisions for Netanyahu, given that he's undertaking some of his own, no doubt.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what he says leading up to this election in November. Now, this comes as there's also more mounting pressure locally and internationally for Benjamin Netanyahu to support a new ceasefire plan for Gaza, which he is resisting over fears it will collapse his government. Members of Netanyahu's far-right coalition have threatened to quit the party if Israel surrenders before total victory over Hamas. Now, that new ceasefire was announced as well by Biden, encouraging Israel to take this on. So, yeah, as you said, it will be an interesting space to watch as it's very politically charged. A new study has found that fast food chains are sneakily influencing some news outlets. The study, led by the University of Sydney's School of Public Health, found that covert marketing was used by brands. The researchers analysed press releases from McDonald's, KFC and Domino's Pizza in Australia between July 2021 and June 2022. Now, the study found press releases translated into overwhelmingly positive coverage of the brands. In most cases, they were largely copied and pasted and published as news articles.
Yeah, this is a little bit naughty in terms of journalism 101, because what then happened was that it gave favourable coverage and the contents of the press releases weren't interrogated. It's easier to fill up column space and just cut and paste something rather than send a journalist out to interrogate it, do checks and balances, get a different voice. Almost half of the articles profiled a new unhealthy food product and more than a fifth promoted a brand's corporate social responsibility credentials. The researchers said that this sort of coverage is an implied endorsement. It's a public health concern. And if you want to know who some of the worst offenders were, perhaps it won't surprise you that it was the Daily Mail. There were also some Murdoch papers in there, like Courier Mail, but it did point out that Australia's national broadcaster, the ABC and The Guardian, didn't publish any of these kind of press release pretend news stories.
And this story did make me think about AI and the conversations we're having around this with misinformation and also taking people's jobs, because a press release or an article could easily be written by AI. But it just made me think, if it was written by AI, would it be more biased? Would it have the same if it's just going to copy and paste anyway?
Oh, there are a whole bunch of problems AI poses. I think the most immediate threat to journalism at the moment is that there are far more people working in PR than there are actual journalists in newsrooms. And so they're already able to influence what gets put out more. Once AI enters in the picture, I don't know, Helen, you and I will be rendered null, void, useless.
Yeah, we might be jobless.
We might be jobless. Stay tuned, guys, for AI presenters with the briefing. A new report has found there's major gaps in our plans to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, and that would mean that we're not getting any closer to meeting our Paris climate targets. Co-author Professor Gregory Nemeth says it's crucial global leaders take more action.
So if we do not halt deforestation and rapidly reduce emissions from fossil fuels, even ambitious levels of carbon dioxide removal deployment will not get us back on track to 1.5 or 2 degrees C.
The report found that the globe needs to remove at least 4 times more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to reach these Paris climate targets.
Yeah, and speaking of climate change, a new report by the Australian National University has found that Australia's ski season could be 55 days shorter by 2050, also due to the climate crisis. And this is even if greenhouse gas emissions are cut radically. And it found that if emissions do remain high, that by 2080 there would only be enough snow to ski for a handful of days during the season.
Wow, that's really interesting. I haven't heard of climate and climate change in this kind of way. And I do wonder if this is going to get people, and I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here, but I just connect skiing with more affluent people and private school kids.
Well, it's expensive.
It's expensive, right? Like it's something. And so now I wonder if a lot of people who live quite comfortably and don't necessarily care too much about the climate and who are a little bit more affluent might be like, oh, this is atrocious. We must do something about climate change. Our ski season only being a handful of days. This cannot be acceptable.
Yeah, I guess.
I don't know. I'm just imagining how this news may be received.
I guess we'll have to wait and see what the government does in response to that. And over in Japan, Tokyo's local government is launching a dating app to help boost the nation's low birth rates. The app will require users to submit official documentation proving they're single, plus a signed letter confirming they are willing to get married, and there'll also be an interview process to confirm the user's identity.
Okay, I guess that's good news or bad news for catfishers. But this is not unusual behaviour for Japan, as matchmaking events are very popular. But this is the first time the government has developed an app to combat the low birth rate. And the app's been on a free test run since late last year, at which time Japan also recorded more than twice as many deaths as new babies as the birth rate fell for the 8th consecutive year.
Yeah, it will be an interesting space to watch. The app is going to be officially launched in Japan towards the end of June this year. And something else that I found really fascinating, that I think it's pretty wild, is that stating your income is also very common on Japanese dating apps.
Yeah, right.
But it does require a tax certificate to prove your annual salary.
So it just sounds like rather than forcing people to have babies, they're just trying to make a more kind of legit dating app where you know that this is the person because we've got their birth certificate. We can't just say like entrepreneur, which really means I sit in my grandmother's basement and try and sell stuff on eBay, and that you're able to wade through the crap of dating apps a little bit faster to then maybe make a baby?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, look, by this information, you've got their whole life story. So, look, if this app does not work to boost the birth rates, I don't know what will.
Thanks so much, Helen. It's now time for Bension's deep dive into AI-generated fake porno images and how those who make it could face 6 years in jail.
AI-generated images and deepfake videos are flooding the internet, and it's become a major frontier in online abuse. More than 4,000 celebrities have reportedly been victimised by deepfake pornography, using their image without consent to create lifelike sexual material. Next month, Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, will testify in a case where she's suing two men for creating deepfake porn using images of her face. Many of these deepfakes have been shared millions and millions of times. And it's not only celebrities. This is frighteningly common, and the technology enabling it is only becoming more powerful and more accessible. Today, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus will introduce new laws into Parliament that would make sharing deepfake porn without consent an offence punishable by years in prison. He joins us now. Mark Dreyfus, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing. Why does the government care about deepfake porn?
This is an insidious behaviour. It's something that produces a degrading and humiliating and dehumanising impact on victims who are largely women and girls. It perpetuates harmful gender stereotypes, and it is contributing to gender-based violence. It's something that is of real concern right across the community.
How widespread is it in Australia?
It's impossible to say how widespread it is, but the complaints that we are hearing tell us that it is increasingly widespread. We've seen incidents of it in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and we know with the introduction of artificial intelligence, the widespread availability of artificial intelligence, that it is every day getting easier to produce this kind of deep fake sexually explicit material.
So you'll be introducing legislation into Parliament today that would make it a crime to share deepfake pornography without consent. What about the people who make it and the AI companies that can enable it? What happens to them?
There's a limit on the Commonwealth's reach here. We can pass legislation that deals with use of telecommunications providers, which is why we are criminalising sharing. We are also taking the opportunity to create an aggravated offence which will increase the penalty for someone who is also the creator of the deepfake sexually explicit material. And these are very serious penalties that we are going to provide. It's a maximum of 6 years for sharing, and for the aggravated offence, it will be 7 years. That's if you have both created the material and shared it. But because the Commonwealth's jurisdiction is limited to the activity of sharing, we'll have to wait perhaps for states to catch up and criminalise the creation activity.
Okay, so let's talk about enforcement. If an anonymous Twitter account shares a deepfake porn image, what hope does law enforcement have of tracing the identity of the person who originally shared it?
This is a problem that law enforcement faces with everything in the digital world. People do hide behind fake identities, people do hide their accounts, but that does not mean that there are not technological means of tracing. We have been able to successfully prosecute for a range of other technology-based offences, and the fact that it's difficult to find someone is not a reason for not legislating. There's a whole range of crimes that are often difficult to detect, difficult to prosecute, but that does not stop us from legislating to ban that activity and providing for serious criminal offences. You've got to remember that there's also a value in the Parliament of Australia sending a message to the community that these activities are criminalised. Criminal law always serves that function of sending a message to the community, drawing lines to say this behaviour is unacceptable, and it's so unacceptable that we are going to criminalise it and provide serious penalties for it. We hope that that message will also have a beneficial effect.
Would you need the cooperation of the social platforms in order for these prosecutions to work? Obviously, Elon Musk hasn't been particularly cooperative with the Australian government recently.
Cooperation from social media platforms is always of assistance, but don't forget that we have other means, including warranted interventions that the Australian Federal Police can use to get at the relevant information that we need in order to make a prosecution stick. So yes, as always, cooperation from the service providers, from the social media platforms is desirable and makes investigation of crimes and prosecution easier, but we've also got some compulsive means available to us to find out the identity of people who are engaging in the sharing of this dreadful material.
You mentioned some instances in the UK and the US. Obviously, the most prominent one of those was the sharing of deepfake pornography images of Taylor Swift. They were shared some 47 million times earlier this year. If an image of an Australian celebrity, for example, went even close to that viral, prosecuting millions of individuals isn't possible, is it?
Prosecuting millions of individuals would probably be not what the Australian Federal Police would engage in, but we would look for the originator of the images, someone who has been directly involved in starting off the viral phenomenon that you mentioned that occurred in the case of Taylor Swift.
Given the huge numbers involved here of the content that we're talking about, how will the government or police be able to keep up? Will this require some kind of new agency or arm of the police to prosecute it?
We don't envisage that that's so. The Australian Federal Police is a well-resourced organisation, and we're very much hoping that if there are some prosecutions, some investigations and some prosecutions and some convictions recorded, that's going to send a very clear message to the Australian community that this kind of behaviour will not be tolerated, that it is a criminal offence, it is something that carries serious consequences.
We know that there is a serious problem in Australia and elsewhere about teenage boys in particular being drawn into misogynistic ideologies. Could we see teenagers prosecuted for the offence that you're creating, and should we?
These offences apply specifically to people over 18. That's because there are already very detailed provisions in the Commonwealth Criminal Code that apply to child abuse material, including that sort of material when it's generated by artificial intelligence. There's already much more serious penalties for that kind of child abuse activity.
But if the person that's sharing it is a teenager?
Well, then potentially they are able to be prosecuted. It's just that they will be treated as a child, and we have different processes in the criminal law to deal with children when they are prosecuted.
The legislation would make it illegal to share non-consensual deepfake pornographic images with another person. There are and will be people who will be creating this as a form of, I suppose, artwork or consensual pornography. How does the government or prosecutors pass consent in that kind of scenario?
Well, the offences are not intended to capture the sharing of legitimate adult pornography. This is about non-consensual sharing of deep fake sexualised images of another person. And not having consent is obviously going to be very easy to prove if the person whose image is being portrayed doesn't even know the originator of the images. If it's a celebrity, for example, who has no knowledge of it. The key to this is non-consensual.
If someone finds and discovers that their image is being used in this way now, what can they do to protect themselves?
Certainly they can make a complaint to the Australian Federal Police. Certainly they should be attempting to make a complaint to the social media provider, the platform where the images have been shown. And it may be that there is some purpose in them also lodging a complaint with the E-Safety Commissioner.
Well, Attorney, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for taking an interest.
Attorney General Mark Dreyfus there. And if you find someone is using sexualised images of you without consent, search for E-Safety Commissioner. The website has a whole rundown on what you can do, including how to potentially get the material taken down from the web. Let us know also what you think of the government's proposed laws. We'd love to hear from you. Send us a message or a voice note to The Briefing Podcast on your socials. And if you like what we do here at The Briefing, do share an episode with a friend. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.